Mark Dybul.
Thanks. And let me begin by agreeing with Steve that the term public-private partnership should sunset. It's not a good term. It's outdated. I would also say up front that some work should be done on public sector governance, actually, because interagency process, I would say PEPFAR was 100 times more complicated than the Global Fund in the interagency process and the difficulty of managing that than the Global Fund is. So at some point, someone might want to look at that because a lot of money is in those things. More money than is in the public-private partnerships. To begin from a philosophical perspective, I think it's important to look back to the Monterey Consensus, which is a strange place to start. It was only 15 years ago, but it actually set the path for things like the Global Fund and Gavi, which Natasha is here. And it had 4 principles. It wasn't just accountability and transparency. It was 1, country ownership, so the countries had to be at the center if we were going to succeed in development. 2, it had to be results-based, not money-based. You know, what are you actually trying to achieve and how much money? 3 was accountability and transparency. And, you know, we've been using those buzzwords now for about 15 years. They're being supplanted by disruption and innovation. We still don't know what any of those 4 mean, but we use them easily. And 5, and this is important, is all sectors needed to be involved. It couldn't just be the public sector. The private sector, civil society had to be engaged. That was the pillar on which the whole negotiation almost collapsed. But the Europeans were dead opposed to engaging the private sector at the time, which is a little bit odd if you look at it, because now everyone wants to talk about the private sector, no matter what government you are. But in many ways, and the reason I mention that is because that document actually, when Gavi and the Global Fund were being structured, it was that document that drove the structure. So the structure was actually to animate a philosophical shift in how we were doing development. I think that's very important. The second point I would make, and this relates a little bit to what Steve says, or what Michael said, you know, the structures that were set up to govern Gavi Global Fund should never be thought of as boards. They are parliaments. They are congressional structures. And we can look at the private sector board, you know, executive function, or we can look at the public sector, which is an executive branch and a parliamentary branch. And that's really the structure that was adopted. We call them boards, but they're not. They're parliaments. And they exist for many things, but one of the main things they were established for was to raise money. And it's much easier to raise money if you have everyone involved than if you don't. And one of the reasons these institutions have succeeded is because there is strong civil society support, there is strong public sector and private sector support. And so without the complexity of that, it would be extraordinarily difficult to raise the amounts of money we're raising. And so that executive parliamentary structure has advantages. It also has downsides. So just to hit off a couple, one is accountability and transparency. I think Michael framed it pretty well. Gavi and the Global Fund went first. In the private sector, going first is usually not a good thing because others will follow your mistakes and then figure out how to do it the other way. It's very difficult for us to fix our mistakes. I was deeply involved in the strong accountability and transparency, which actually came later from the Inspector General perspective for the Global Fund. But you should never go further than everyone else. And if you're the only one doing something and no one else is doing it, it can cause trouble. And I think we went too far on the accountability, transparency, and the Inspector General because no one else has it and almost led to the end of the institution. And so I think there's a lot about Michael's point on to whom, what do you put forward. I like his family analogy. The second thing I would point out, our third, well, I guess I'm on third things, is membership and voting. And this gets a little bit complicated. And if you're going to be a parliament, you actually have to figure that out. And I don't think we did it very well on 2 counts. One is being clear on who is at the table, why they're at the table, which means expectations around why you're at the table. And 2 examples I would give is, and I'll come back to this, it was structured as 10 voting seats for implementers, what was called recipients, and 10 for donors. And then there are alternates, which gets you to a board of 40, plus some non-voting members. The private sector was in the donor group. The donor seats are actually based on, and this was clearly set, the amount of money you gave. And so you have constituencies of 10 donors, 10 countries, or Bill Gates on his own, 10 countries because they have to add up their amounts to get to that level. The private sector has given, outside of Project Red, have given almost nothing. really, in the big scheme of things, but they still hold a donor seat. So that expectation was actually just brushed aside to fulfill, we have a private sector at the table, but they're not meeting their donor seat requirements. But we can't change that, and which I'll come back to. The second I would say is representation, and this gets into if you're a parliament, what is your role there? And unfortunately, we weren't clear on that. And so constituencies for a long time have come strictly to represent their constituency and vote according to their constituency and their constituency's desires, rather than saying, this is what our constituency thinks, but when you vote, you have to vote in the context of what is best for the organization or structure. And we are not good at that. And I'll come back to why the voting structure matters. So the membership pieces really have to be thought about. And lots of public-private partnerships that are trying to start come to us and ask us about what we've learned. This is one of the biggest ones I tell them. Be very careful and clear about what your membership requirements are and expectations are. The second related to that is your voting structure. This was a big mistake the Global Fund made. We set it up in things that I think are no longer applicable, a donor block and a recipient block, as if they're against each other, which immediately tells people, you're not cohering, you're not actually trying to get to a common goal. The second is the whole notion of donors and recipients is outdated already 15 years later, thank God. The fact that we still call ourselves donors, I think, is appalling. At least we changed from recipients to implementers. But those blocks already set up a confrontation. The second is the blocking minority vote, which is the block in the Global Fund gets complicated. So we have a blocking minority, so if 4 members of any one of the 10 blocks of donor and implementer votes no, it doesn't matter if the 16 vote yes. Now, interestingly, the donors put that in place because they were afraid with civil society and the implementers on the board, they wanted a protective mechanism. It's turned out that the civil society groups use it to block what the others in the board want. And so it's actually become very complicated. But once you set up that structure, you can't change it because you have the blocking minority, so you can never change it. And so the fund is stuck with this antiquated donor implementer block, which we can't get rid of, which means you can't bring in emerging partners. The world's changed in 15 years. There are lots of big countries that are creating big development structures. We can't even bring them into the board. And if you can't be in the board and you can't vote, why on earth would you give money or engage with an institution? So, we're kind of stuck there, not to mention it's really hard to go around among the donors and say we have donors and implementers when they've moved on and the SDGs have moved on. And so we're kind of stuck with these antiquated things. The second thing I would talk about briefly, and Mohammed will go into this more, is in-country. Because the in-country piece is in many ways more important, especially for the Global Fund, than the global piece. And we tried to structure that same approach through country coordinating mechanisms in the countries. And it hasn't worked particularly well in a lot of places. It's worked very well in some and not so well in others. It has to relate with government dominance and difficulty balancing all of that and having civil society at the table. But it's also a lot of conflict of interest. You tend to have the people who are getting the grant money making decisions on how the grant application should be structured, and that gets a little complicated and it's very difficult. But I think that's an area that requires as much work, if not more. As we're looking to the future, we should be in the countries. That country ownership principle, we're still not as good as and we really need to focus on what's happening in the countries with these global things as much as what's happening in the central structures.